The air was cold that morning in Omaha. Winter had crept into the city, bringing with it a grey silence that seemed to press gently against the windows of the Berkshire Hathaway headquarters. Warren Buffett, now well into his 90s, arrived. Early as he always did, same route, same coffee, same calm pace. There was something sacred about routine for him. But that morning was different. He just didn't know it yet. He sat in his modest office, a space unchanged for decades, surrounded by books worn with use and a quiet dignity that seemed to hang in the air. As he adjusted his glasses and opened the morning paper, a small envelope fell from between its folds. There was no return address, just his name. Buffett paused, eyebrows slightly furrowed, and opened it. Inside, a short note written in shaky but familiar handwriting. "Mr. Buffett, I doubt you remember me. I used to work at your first textile mill. I'm still there. I never left. Just thought you should know. GM." Warren sat back in his chair. GM, only one name came to mind: George Milner. A boy from the early days, a name buried under mountains of investment deals, board meetings, and decades of change. And yet, like a dusty coin found between the couch, cushions of memory, it glinted with unexpected clarity. The Milner years. George had been the first to clock in at the failing textile plant Warren had bought in the 60s. A time when the building smelled of cotton dust and tired men. George had been young then, maybe 22, bright-eyed, curious, the kind who said good morning with sincerity. Buffett remembered him not because George had done anything extraordinary, but because he hadn't. He'd been consistent, honest, hard-working, in a way that didn't ask to be noticed. The kind of man who never took a shortcut, even when no one was watching. As years passed, Buffett moved on. He left the textile industry behind, redirecting his vision to insurance, banking, and long-term investments. The plant closed, but many workers were moved to other facilities or offered severance. George never left. The letter said he was still working there, but that was impossible. The building had been sold, repurposed, demolished perhaps. Buffett called in his longtime assistant Sharon, now semi-retired herself, but always available when he needed her. "Sharon, do we still have any records on the original Berkshire plant employees, specifically someone named George Milner?" She gave him a look, half curiosity, half concern, but nodded and left. Within the hour she returned, holding a yellowed personnel file from the archives. "Found him. Hired in 1964. Never formally resigned. There are some pension records, but, oddly, he never cashed them out." Buffett leaned forward. "Where is he now?" "Still listed under an address in Millard, a retirement complex, but no retirement filed. It looks like he's working janitorial shifts at the new packaging facility." It had been decades since Warren had last thought of Harold Martin, the soft-spoken teenager who once ran errands at his father's small grocery store back in Omaha. Harold had been the kind of boy who never made noise but always made things work, reliable, polite, invisible to most, except to Warren. Back then, in the 1940s, Harold had cleaned floors, stacked shelves, and walked the long blocks downtown to deliver groceries for customers who couldn't come in person. Warren, barely a boy himself, remembered how Harold would whistle the same tune every morning, rain or shine. Harold wasn't just an employee. He had been a presence, steady and humble, like a quiet thread woven into the background of Warren's childhood. So when Warren saw that same fragile man, now 87, bent slightly, from age but still holding that unmistakable calm, his breath caught in his chest. Harold hadn't seen Warren yet. He was wiping down a corner table, humming softly to himself, as though time had never passed. Warren didn't approach immediately. He stood by the doorway of the cafe for a moment, his mind overwhelmed with memories, and a rare sense of stillness washed over him. It wasn't often that someone like Warren Buffett was caught off guard. But this was different. He sat quietly at a back table, removing his hat and watching Harold work. His assistant asked if he should intervene, but Warren raised his hand slightly, signaling silence. Warren wanted to see him as he remembered him, working, serving, giving, without ever expecting anything in return. When Harold finally noticed the familiar face watching him, he paused, his cloth still in hand. His eyes blinked once, twice, and then widened. "Warren," he whispered, disbelieving. Buffett stood slowly, walked to him, and extended his hand. But Harold didn't take it. Instead, he wrapped his arms around the man who had once been a boy, running beside him through the back alleys of Omaha's quiet streets. They sat together at the cafe's corner booth, the one with the view of the oak tree outside. Still, standing after all those years. "I thought you were long gone, Harold," Warren said softly. "I never left," Harold replied with a tired smile. "This place, it's all I've known. People come, people go. I stay, keeps me moving." "But you're 87, Warren said. "Why are you still working?" Harold hesitated, then looked down at his calloused hands. "Pensions didn't stretch as far as I hoped. Wife passed years ago. No children. This cafe keeps me fed, keeps me sane. And, well, some of us just don't know how to stop working." Warren nodded slowly, the weight of Harold's words settling into his chest like an anchor. For a man who had built empires, the simplicity and sadness of Harold's reality struck him deeply. Harold never asked for help, never hinted at needing anything, and Warren knew that was exactly why he had to act, but not publicly, not with press, not with noise. Silence, Warren had learned, was the most powerful form of giving. That evening, Warren returned to his hotel suite overlooking downtown Omaha. But his mind wasn't on the meeting he had scheduled for the morning, nor on the portfolio updates that waited on his desk. His thoughts were on Harold, not the Harold of now, tired, solitary, bound to a small cafe for survival, but the Harold of then. The boy with cracked hands and honest eyes who never complained, who always showed up, who represented a time when decency was currency and hard work was its own reward. Buffett sat by the window with a glass of iced tea in hand, watching the night fall over the city that had made him who he was. Somewhere beneath that skyline was a man who had helped build his foundation, quietly, without recognition. And now, Warren thought, it was time to return the favor. He picked up his notepad, the yellow legal pad he always carried, and began to write. Not plans, not financial projections, just names, dates, memories, the moments Harold had shown up when no one else had, the times he'd covered for others, the times he'd smiled through exhaustion. Warren didn't need to be reminded of wealth. He needed to be reminded of meaning. The next morning, Buffett canceled 2 meetings and made a phone call to his longtime lawyer. "I need something done quietly," he said. "No press, no publicity, just dignity." It wasn't the first time Warren had made such a request, but there was something different in his voice now, A weight, a depth, a kind of urgency that came not from time running out, but from time coming full circle. Over the next few days, arrangements were made. Buffett didn't return to the cafe. Right away, he wanted things done first, properly, thoroughly. He contacted the building's landlord, anonymously. He arranged for the cafe's lease to be fully covered for the next decade. A quiet legal structure was established, transferring ownership of the business to Harold, along with a generous operational fund. Then came the medical insurance, a private plan, fully covered, with long-term care options, no forms, no stress, and, finally, a home. Not a flashy mansion, just a warm one-story house with a garden near a park Harold used to take his wife to. A place where silence lived, where memories could breathe. Warren oversaw every detail himself. The color of the curtains, the orientation of the armchair by the window, the radio in the kitchen, tuned permanently to Harold's favorite jazz station. He told no one. Not even his assistant knew the full extent of what was being done. When she asked if the trip was about business, he simply replied, "It's personal." When all was ready, when every document was signed, every key delivered, every flower planted, Buffett returned to the cafe. This time, he wore no hat, no suit, just a sweater and a quiet expression. Harold was behind the counter, wiping down the same coffee machine as before. When he looked up, he smiled, not because of who Warren was, but because of who he had always been. Buffett walked up and placed a small envelope on the counter. "What's this?" Harold asked. Thank you," Warren replied. "Decades overdue." Harold opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. No logos, no signatures, just a handwritten message in Buffett's unmistakable cursive. "You gave more than your hands. You gave stability, presence, and quiet honor. Now it's time for someone else to show up for you. The cafe is yours. The burden is not. Your home awaits, and this time you don't have to earn it." For a long moment, Harold said nothing. His eyes didn't blink. His breath was shallow. Then, without looking up, he folded the letter and placed it carefully back in the envelope. "I didn't do anything special," he whispered. "That's exactly why it matters," Warren replied. Harold shook his head. "All I ever did was show up, and the world has a shortage of that," Warren said softly. "Men who show up without applause, without conditions." There were no more words between them. There didn't need to be. Later that afternoon, Harold stepped outside the cafe to see a car waiting. Quiet, modest, elegant. The driver greeted him with a nod and opened the door. Harold looked back at the building, the small brick shop that had housed so many of his years, and exhaled, not in sadness, in release. As they drove through the old streets of Omaha, memories floated through the windows like gentle ghosts. The corner where he met his wife, the schoolyard where his brother used to play, the bench he sat on after his father's funeral, and then the car turned into a narrow street lined with trees, where sunlight filtered through the leaves like golden lace. There it was, a house with a porch, a blue door, and a wooden swing. The driver handed him the key and said only, "Welcome home." Inside, every detail whispered care. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon oil and coffee. On the small dining table sat a radio, already playing the soft saxophone of a familiar tune, one Harold hadn't heard in years but recognized instantly. In the living room, an old bookshelf, filled, not with random titles but with the Books Harold had once mentioned in passing decades ago. Someone had remembered, on the windowsill, a photograph. It was a black and white image, faded by time. A young Harold working at the grocery store beside a boy with curious eyes. Warren, no more than 10. Harold picked up the frame and held it close to his chest. He didn't cry, but in his silence there was a sound deeper than tears. The sound of a life finally acknowledged. That night Harold didn't sleep much, not because of discomfort. The bed was soft, the sheets new, the air still, but because his mind was full, not busy. Full. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't about bills or schedules. They weren't tangled in survival. They were drifting into memory, into meaning. He walked barefoot through the quiet house, running his hand across furniture he hadn't chosen, but somehow felt chosen by. Everything seemed familiar, as if someone had built a space out of fragments from his own life. On a small wooden desk in the study, Harold found a stack of letters tied with twine. Some were old notes he had written to his wife. Others were reproductions of customer thank-you cards from the store in the 1940s. Someone had gathered the pieces of his story, not just the financial ones, but the human ones. He sat down by the window and looked out over the moonlit yard, and for the first time in decades, Harold felt seen. He thought of Warren. Not the billionaire, but the boy, the one who asked too many questions, the one who used to count soda bottle caps like treasure, the one who had watched Harold work when no one else had noticed. People talk about legacies as if they're made of concrete and headlines. But Harold understood now. The real ones are made of quieter things. A door held open for a stranger, a boy remembered 70 years later, a life lived without needing to be loud. The next morning, Harold stepped outside with a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the crisp Nebraska air. Across the street, a neighbor walking his dog waved. Another man tipped his cap. He wasn't invisible anymore. And not because of money or status or pity, but because someone had named his story, had honored it. At noon, a small envelope arrived. No address, just his name. Inside was a simple card, handwritten again. You. Didn't go unnoticed. Some lights don't flicker. They just shine quietly for a long, long time. W.B. Harold folded the card and placed it inside his pocket. He didn't need more. This was enough. Later that day, he returned. To the cafe, not to work, but to sit. The regulars greeted him, surprised to see him in a sweater instead of an apron. He smiled, nodded, and took a seat by the window. "I'm retired," he told the barista with a chuckle. "Took me 87 years to get here." Everyone laughed, but no one knew the whole story, and Harold didn't feel the need to tell it. Some things are better left as whispers between lives. Back at his office, high above the Omaha skyline, Warren Buffett sat alone with a worn photo frame in his hand. The same black-and-white image that Harold now kept by his window. He turned it over slowly, remembering the day it was taken. A boy with ink-stained fingers, a teenage Harold with rolled-up sleeves and a tired smile. Behind them, the shelves of the grocery store where so much of Buffett's early view of the world had formed. He had met kings, presidents, CEOs who moved entire markets. But that boy in the picture, and the man he had become, reminded Warren of something more valuable than capital: constancy. Warren had spent his life investing in companies, in markets, in ideas. But the best investment he ever made, he thought now, might have been in something he didn't even realize he was holding on to, the quiet presence of good people. He stared out the window, watching people move like ants below. How many of them had been Harold to someone? How many unnoticed lives carried the weight of others without even realizing it? That question lingered, not with guilt, but with reverence. Buffett wasn't a sentimental man by nature, not in the way the world often paints him, but he understood value. And value, he now believed more deeply than ever, wasn't always listed in balance sheets. Later that week, Warren wrote a note to himself, the kind he'd normally keep tucked in a drawer of unfinished thoughts. The quiet ones carry the world. Build less noise. Leave more presence. He underlined the last sentence twice, then folded it, placed it in his wallet and went about his day. But something inside him had shifted. At the next Berkshire shareholder meeting, he stood before the crowd. Thousands of eager investors waiting for insights and predictions. But instead of starting with numbers or forecasts, Warren paused. I want to open with a story, he said. Not about profits, but about presence. He didn't mention Harold by name. He didn't have to. He spoke about the power of those who show up without being seen, about legacies that live quietly in the background, about value that can't be measured in percentages. And for a moment in that massive arena, a silence fell. The kind of silence you feel in your chest, not absence. Meaning. Spring passed gently over Omaha that year. The city bloomed in its quiet way, not in fireworks or noise, but in the slow return of color to the trees and warmth to the sidewalks. At the house with the blue door, Harold had settled into a rhythm. Every morning he would step out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee and sit on the wooden swing. Sometimes he'd read, other times he'd just watch. The world moved at its own pace, and for once he didn't feel behind. Neighbors began to greet him by name. Children riding bikes waved as they passed, not knowing who he was, but sensing something peaceful about the man who always smiled from his swing. He started leaving folded paper cranes on the park bench across the street, one each morning. He never said why, but those who saw them began to take notice. Some took them home. Others left their own in return. The small gesture became a ritual in the neighborhood, a silent message that someone was watching, someone still cared. Inside his home, Harold began writing. Not a book, not for anyone to read, just thoughts, memories, names of people he remembered from the store, moments that felt small back then, but now glowed with significance. The woman who couldn't afford bread one winter. The boy who used to steal candy and leave apology notes the next day. The soldier who shipped out and never returned. These weren't stories for the world. They were reminders that his life had been lived, not loudly, but deeply. One afternoon, a young man knocked at his door, early 20s, nervous, holding. "A book, Mr. Harold?" he asked. "That's me," Harold smiled. "I live down the street. My grandmother used to talk about a man who worked at a store with her father. I think it was you." Harold invited him in. They spoke for hours about old Omaha, about values that felt forgotten, about how the smallest people often carry the largest loads. The young man left with a notebook full of quotes and eyes wide with thought. Harold sat back, satisfied. He didn't need statues or speeches. Sometimes legacy was just a door left, open for someone else to walk through. It was late evening when Warren returned to his study. The day had been filled with meetings, calls, numbers, the familiar hum of the world he had mastered, but something lingered beneath it all. A presence. He sat down at the edge of the couch, loosened his tie, and opened a leather notebook he hadn't touched in years. It was old, almost brittle, filled with hand-drawn tables from decades ago. But between the pages, tucked like a forgotten secret, was a photo, not the store, not the business. It was a picture of his father, Howard Buffett, standing with 3 employees outside the grocery shop. One of them was Harold. Warren stared at it for a long time, longer than he expected. In a world obsessed with forward motion, Harold had reminded him of the anchor, the necessity of roots, of memory, of grounded values that don't age even. When people do, Warren took out a pen and began writing. Not an op-ed, not a speech, just a letter, a private one, meant only for Harold. You were never in the headlines, but you were always part of the foundation. You showed me, without ever saying. A word that wealth isn't what we hold, it's what we leave behind in others. He folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it beside his desk lamp. No courier would deliver it. He'd bring it himself. The next day, Warren arrived at Harold's new home just as the sun was rising. He didn't knock immediately. He stood by the gate, watching the porch sway gently in the morning breeze. Eventually, Harold noticed him from the window. With a smile, he opened the door and waved him in, as if they had known each other in every chapter of their lives. They sat together at the kitchen table, now slightly worn from use, the kind of wear that gave things meaning. Warren handed Harold the letter. "I've said enough already," he said. "This one's for when I'm not around anymore." Harold didn't open it. He didn't need to. The gesture was the message. They spoke little after that. Sometimes the most powerful conversations happen in silence, when 2 people understand that no more words are needed to honor a life. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the community around Harold. It wasn't because of headlines. There weren't any. No news outlet had covered the story. No social media post had gone viral. It all remained as it had begun, silent, but the people around him had noticed. And more than that, they had felt it. The young man who once visited. Harold began volunteering at a local food bank. A waitress at the cafe started leaving small handwritten notes for elderly customers. Little encouragements, folded neatly beside their receipts. One of Harold's neighbors, an old retired mechanic, began fixing broken bicycles left near the park, just leaving them leaning against trees for the kids to find. None of them said why they were doing it, but somehow they knew. Warren heard about these things in passing. He never took credit. He never spoke of what had happened with Harold, not in interviews, not even to close friends, but something in him had softened. He started walking more. He lingered longer in conversations. He began answering handwritten letters again. Something he hadn't done in years. One day, while speaking with a group of young interns at his office, a bright-eyed student asked, "Mr. Buffett, what's the most important investment you've ever made?" Warren paused. The room quieted. Everyone expected a company name, a date, a stock, but instead he replied, "A man once showed up for me when I was too young to know what that meant. He did it every day, without asking for anything. One day, much later, I showed up for him. That's the only investment I've ever made that paid in peace." There was silence. The interns didn't know who he was talking about, but they felt the weight of the answer, and maybe that was enough. That evening, Warren sat alone once more, watching the sunset cast gold over Omaha's rooftops. In a world full of metrics, he had found a moment that couldn't be measured. It wasn't on a graph, it wouldn't be recorded in earnings reports, but it was real, and it would last longer than any market cycle. Harold's days grew slower, but not emptier. He had no grand bucket list, no rush to travel the world. His world was already here, in the rustling leaves outside his window, in the familiar smell of ground coffee each morning, in the birds that gathered by the feeder he filled daily with quiet devotion. He began planting small flowers along the sidewalk, not in any pattern, just where the soil felt soft. Neighbors asked what kind they were, and he'd shrug with a smile. "Not sure. I just like the color." There was something profoundly beautiful in that. Planting without knowing the name, giving without needing a reason. On Sundays, Warren would sometimes drive by the neighborhood. He never stopped unless invited, but he always slowed near the park, near the swing, near the blue door. He liked knowing Harold was there, still steady, still present. One day, he parked and walked a quiet lap around the block. As he passed Harold's house, he saw the man asleep on the swing, a blanket over his lap, a book resting open on his chest. Warren smiled. It was a rare moment when the world felt exactly as it should. Months passed, seasons turned. One afternoon in early fall, Harold fell ill. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, just a soft turning inward, like a candle recognizing its final hour. He was taken to a small hospice just a few blocks from the cafe. The nurses knew who he was, not because of fame, but because of the way people spoke of him. They treated him gently, not like a man nearing death, but like a man who had lived fully. Warren visited on a quiet Wednesday. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Buffett sat beside the bed, holding Harold's hand. "I just wanted to say thank you," Warren whispered. Harold turned his head slightly and smiled. "For what?" he asked. "For showing up," Warren replied. The room was silent, but in that silence there was peace, the kind that only comes when lives have touched and closed their circles with grace. Harold passed quietly 2 mornings later. Just as the sun began to touch the edge of the window pane, a nurse said he had smiled in his sleep, the kind of smile that didn't come from dreams, but from completion. There was no ceremony, no broadcast, no headline. But word spread, through whispers, through nods, through glances between neighbors. The man on the porch swing had gone, and something about the street felt different, softer, quieter, holier, in a way no one could explain. Buffett received the call while standing in the middle of a boardroom discussion. He excused himself, walked to the window, and said nothing for several minutes. Then he smiled. It wasn't joy and it wasn't sadness, it was peace, a kind of final return to something that had been part of him all along. A week later, Warren visited Harold's house for the last time. He walked through each room slowly, touching nothing, but taking everything in. On the desk beside the window he found the photograph again, the one of the boy and the teenager outside the grocery store. Beside it now sat a folded note in Harold's handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me. That's all any of us ever want." Buffett placed the note into his jacket pocket and sat down in the same chair Harold once favored. For a long time he said nothing. He simply looked out the window. not at the yard, but at the path they had. Both walked, one with footsteps, the other with memory. The next day, Buffett donated anonymously to the local library, a quiet contribution to restore the children's section Harold had once visited as a boy. He had one condition, a single plaque, no names, just a sentence, for those who show up quietly and carry the world without asking. At the next annual meeting, Buffett ended his speech early. He stood in front of thousands and said, "We talk about returns, dividends, and growth. But let's not forget, the most important investment you'll ever make is in someone who thinks no one notices them. Invest in people who never ask for attention. That's where real wealth is stored." The audience applauded, but the moment wasn't about them. It was about a man they'd never meet. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Warren Buffett arrived early at the Berkshire office. The city was still yawning, half asleep under a pale, orange sky. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed a new face. A young intern, maybe 18 or 19, nervously stacking folders at the reception desk. She fumbled and dropped a few. Warren watched as she bent down, frustrated, trying to gather the papers. No one else noticed. He walked over, picked up one of the folders, and handed it to her with a warm smile. "First week?" he asked. She nodded, cheeks flushed. "I didn't expect to see, well, you." Buffett chuckled. "Neither did I. But we all start somewhere." He looked at her, really looked, and saw the same quiet willingness he once saw in Harold. A presence, someone who might one day carry more than tasks, someone who might carry people without anyone realizing it. He paused. Then, without thinking, he reached into his wallet and removed the note he had written months ago, the one he kept tucked behind his ID. He handed it to her. "Build less noise. Leave more presence." She looked at it, confused. "What does this mean?" she asked softly. "It means," Warren said, turning to walk away, "you matter more than you know. Just keep showing up." That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Buffett sat in his office, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. He didn't feel old. He didn't feel tired. He felt grateful. Not for his wealth, not for the companies, but for the few people who had shown him, without saying a word, what it meant to live a life of meaning. Harold had never asked for anything, and yet he had given Warren something he could never put on paper. A reminder that some investments are invisible and some legacies are written in the quiet, steady hands of those who never stop showing up. In the months after Harold's passing, Warren found himself noticing the unnoticed, a janitor humming softly as he polished the floor of a quiet conference hall, a young man offering his seat to an elderly stranger on the streetcar, a schoolboy helping his younger sister tie her shoes, while the rest of the world rushed by. He began to see the world in layers, not of wealth or ambition, but of presence, and perhaps more importantly, of echoes. One afternoon, Warren was invited to speak at a local high school, something he rarely did. The school had recently opened a small entrepreneurship program for underserved youth, and the principal, with quiet persistence, had asked Buffett to visit. He accepted, but requested no press, no sponsors, no banners. When he arrived, the students were already seated in folding chairs in a simple auditorium. They didn't expect much. Most didn't really know who he was, only that some old guy from Omaha with money was going to talk to them. Buffett stood before them, holding nothing but a folded piece of paper. "I was going to tell you about compound interest," he began, smiling, but I think you already know what it means to wait for things that matter." The room was still. Then he unfolded the paper. The same message he once gave to the intern: build less noise, leave more presence. He paused. "Some of you think you'll never be noticed," he said, "that no one's watching, that showing. Up early or staying late doesn't matter, but it does. You matter, even when no one says so." He told them about Harold. Not his name, not the cafe, not the money, but the presence. The man who showed up every day, shaped a future, and never asked for credit. After the talk, a student approached Warren outside. "Do you really believe people like that change the world?" Buffett looked at the boy, his worn backpack, his cracked phone, his hungry eyes, and nodded. "I don't believe it," he said. "I lived it." That night, Warren wrote a note in his journal, something he hadn't done in a while. The quiet ones build bridges no one else sees. They become the reason others keep walking, and if we're lucky, we get to be their witness. He closed the journal, turned off the light, and for the first time in weeks, slept deeply. Because some stories don't end. They simply begin again through someone else. Her name was Marisol. She was 26, worked at a local bookstore, and had never heard the name Harold Martin. But one evening, while shelving a donation of old community records, she came across a box marked Local Heroes, Unpublished Notes. Inside were typed interviews, clippings, and handwritten reflections collected by a late journalist who had spent years quietly documenting people who made a difference in Omaha. Not through fame, but through presence. One envelope was labeled simply, "The Cafe Man." As she began reading, the pieces slowly came together. A janitor at a cafe who paid for a young girl's school lunch when the register failed, who once walked a child home in the snow when her ride didn't show, who repaired a broken park, bench where kids read after school. None of the people in the notes had known his name, just the Cafe Man. Marisol froze. She realized she had been that little girl, 6 years old, coat soaked through, eyes full of tears, alone by the school fence, and someone had walked her home, quietly, kindly, without asking questions. It had been him. That night, she walked to the cafe. It looked different now, a little newer, slightly busier, but the bones of the place were the same. She sat at a corner table and ordered tea. When the waitress brought the cup, Marisol asked, "Do you know who used to work here? A man, older, kind, no apron, but he always smiled." The waitress tilted her head, smiled softly. "You mean Harold," she said. "He was the heart of this place." Marisol looked down at her tea. Overwhelmed by a wave of memory she didn't know she still carried. The next morning, she wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just a page with a single line. Sometimes kindness wraps itself around you so gently you don't know it saved your life until years later. She folded the note, walked to the park where Harold used to sit, and tucked it into the crack of the old bench. The one someone had once fixed. For the kids. She didn't sign it. Some legacies, she thought, don't need names. They just need to keep moving forward. Jamal hadn't thought about the cafe in years. He was 34 now, managing a shipping center on the other side of town. Most of his days were filled with invoices, complaints, truck delays, and managing a staff that was younger, louder, and often distracted. He wasn't bitter, just tired. But one evening, while organizing some old boxes in his garage, he came across a sealed envelope with the cafe's logo. Inside, a note in worn handwriting. To Jamal, you've got more light in you than you think. Keep your chin up and your words solid. Harold, he remembered it now. He'd been 17, working weekends at the cafe, trying to save up for his GED. He was angry most days, at his father, at school, at himself. Harold had never pushed him, never corrected him harshly, just modelled something different. Steady hands, steady voice, clean workspace, quiet kindness. And when Jamal left for his final shift, unsure if he'd ever make anything of himself, Harold had slipped him that note with his paycheck. He hadn't opened it then. Too proud, too scared. He had kept it unopened all these years, as if the words inside had to wait for the right moment to reach him. The next morning, Jamal arrived at work early. Before the lights, before the noise, he walked the floor, rearranged the supply racks himself, swept the corners. No one noticed. Then, when his team arrived, he did something he'd never done before. He greeted each one by name. He thanked the driver who always stayed late. He offered to help the clerk who struggled with the loading dock, a software. And when a temp worker spilled an entire box of invoices in front of a customer, Jamal knelt beside him, helped gather the papers, and said quietly, "It's okay. Everyone drops something sometime." That night, he sat with his son at the dinner table, helping him sound out words from a book about astronauts. His son looked up and asked, "Dad, what do you do?" Jamal thought for a moment. Not about titles, not about roles. "I help people." "Stay calm," he said. His son smiled, "And that's cool." And Jamal realized Harold's presence lived in him now. Quietly, invisibly, like a compass that didn't point north, but pointed home. The next day, he returned to the cafe, just to see it. New faces, new tables, same sun through the same window. He didn't ask for anything. He just sat in Harold's old booth, drank a quiet cup of coffee, and left a folded note under the sugar jar. "You taught me how to be steady. I'm trying to pass it on." She was a teacher, not of math or science, but of life, in the form of literature. Ms. Alvarez ran the after-school poetry club at a local high school, where most students stayed late not for inspiration, but for warmth and quiet. One afternoon, while cleaning the empty classroom, she found a small folded note stuck between the pages of an old poetry anthology. It was yellowed, creased at the edges, but the handwriting was careful, deliberate. Some lights never shine to be seen. They shine so others don't feel lost. No name, no date, just the words. She pinned it to the corkboard above her desk. That evening, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about the simplicity, the humility, stirred something in her. And when her students arrived the next day, she handed each of them a blank card and a pen. "Write something," she said, "for someone who helped you, and maybe doesn't even know it." At first, they resisted. Then, slowly, pens began to move. One girl wrote to her grandmother who raised her. A boy scribbled a message to the janitor, who always held the door and said, "Keep going." Another wrote to a neighbor who left food at their door during a hard winter. None of the cards were signed with names, just the initials of the sender. Ms. Alvarez collected the notes and took them to the park. There, she slipped them one into the pages of books at the free lending library box beneath tree roots and inside the slats of public benches. She didn't know why she felt compelled to do it, only that kindness had to move. It couldn't sit still. A week later, A father found one of the cards while walking his daughter home. The message was simple: you matter, even when no one says so. He didn't speak of it, but something in his gait changed. That night, for the first time in weeks, he read a story to his daughter without checking his phone. She noticed. Back at his office, Warren received a small envelope, no return address. Inside was one of the original poems Harold used to keep in his wallet. It had been scanned, reprinted, and anonymously shared. At the bottom, someone had written in pencil, "This came to me through 4 people. None of them knew where it started, but somehow it ended up here. Thank you." Warren stared at it for a long moment, then without a word he smiled. In that instant he knew Harold's legacy was no longer his to carry. It had taken root, and now it was moving, unseen, quiet, unstoppable. Warren Buffett didn't fear age. He had watched it approach like the steady ticking of a well-made watch, patient, precise, without cruelty. But what surprised him wasn't the body slowing down. It was the way time had softened the sharp edges of urgency. In his youth, everything had felt like a race, to understand, to acquire, to build. But now, in the quiet hours of early morning, he found himself more interested in what remained than in what was still to come. He had downsized his commitments. More walks, fewer meetings, more handwritten letters, fewer keynote speeches. He had started reading old journals again, not for nostalgia, but for clues, trying to retrace the line that connected who he was to who he had become. And in every thread, Harold's presence returned, not as a figure, but as a filter. Every deal he evaluated, he found himself asking, would this serve someone like Harold? Every decision, would it be worthy of the ones who go unseen? One Sunday morning, Warren visited his childhood home, now preserved as a historical site. He asked to walk through alone. The creaking floorboards, the dust in corners, the echo of memories he hadn't heard in years, they welcomed him like old friends. In the back pantry he saw it, the wooden shelf where Harold once stocked cans with quiet precision, and where a young Warren had first begun to ask questions about value, cost, and trust. He sat down on an old bench by the side entrance. The sun filtered through the dusty glass. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he wept. Not from sadness, from gratitude. A few weeks later, Warren recorded a message. It wasn't for the media or shareholders. It was for the archives, a simple video, stored in a private file to be played only after his passing. In it, he spoke not of markets or predictions. He spoke of people, of presence, of a man named Harold who had once carried groceries, and unknowingly a future. We measure success by so many things, but I've come to believe the most valuable asset we have is the space we occupy in someone else's memory, not for what we gave, but for how we made them feel seen. Harold never raised his voice, never asked for thanks, but his life taught me more than any business book. If you're watching this, I hope you take one thing with you. Wealth fades, wisdom echoes, kindness compounds. He smiled at the camera, soft, final, complete. His name was Eli, 12 years old, curious, restless. He lived 3 blocks from the cafe. Every day after school he passed by the shop on his bike, glancing through the window at the warm light, the wooden chairs, and the little sign that read, "Established in 1947. He didn't know the story, didn't know about Harold, didn't know about Warren, but he felt something there. One afternoon, it started to rain, fast and hard, Nebraska style. He ducked under the cafe awning, dripping, clutching his sketchbook. A kind waitress noticed, opened the door, and handed him a towel. "Come in, kid. Sit by the window." He did. She brought him a hot chocolate. No charge. And for the next hour, Eli drew quietly, sipping and watching the world blur behind the droplets. On the glass, when he stood to leave, he reached for his pocket. The waitress smiled. "You're good." "Thanks," he said, embarrassed. "I'll pay next time." "You already did," she said, nodding to the napkin he'd left behind, covered in pencil lines. A sketch of the cafe, warm and alive, framed by streaks of rain. That night, Eli told his mother, "There's something special in that place. I don't know what, but it feels like it remembers people." She smiled. She had once been brought there as a child by a teacher who said the same thing. Years passed. Eli grew, became an artist, opened a small studio across from that same cafe, never moved far from it. He began painting scenes of everyday kindness. A woman tying an old man's shoe, a boy sharing a sandwich, a stranger holding an umbrella over someone's head at a bus stop. They weren't flashy, weren't modern, but they moved people. One evening, a curator from a city gallery visited and asked, "Where do you find these moments?" Eli simply answered, "I think they find me." At his first solo exhibition, tucked between the frames, was a tiny card. Most visitors missed it, but those who read it never forgot. "This is for the ones who stayed late without asking, who refilled the sugar jar, who walked you home without a word. You don't know them, but you feel them. No signature, just the letter H in cursive." Eli never knew where the cafe got that sign, or who the man in the faded photo on the wall was, but he knew something about presence. He knew that quiet people leave loud echoes, and that somehow those echoes had shaped the way he saw the world. And so, in a small town in Nebraska, long after the two men who shaped the story had passed, a boy with a sketchbook sat beside a window and kept the light going. In the end, no one really remembered the headlines from that year. The markets rose and fell. Politicians debated policies that would soon be replaced. New companies exploded overnight. And yet, somewhere between all that, noise, something quieter, continued to move. A memory here, a gesture there. An echo passed from one stranger to another, not in name, but in feeling. Buffett passed away peacefully just after his 100th birthday. There were tributes, memorials, special editions of financial journals, but the story that traveled furthest wasn't the biggest. It was the one told by a barista in a small-town cafe who once found a handwritten note in the tip jar, folded like a fortune cookie. Kindness is a currency that never devalues. She didn't know where it came from, but she pinned it to the corkboard near the register, and within days, people began leaving their own. Not tips. Words. A retired nurse wrote, "You reminded me of my father. Thank you for the tea." A college student scribbled, "Your smile saved me." Today, a child printed in block letters, "You make me feel brave." The board filled, the cafe changed, and yet it had always been that kind of place, long before anyone realized. No statue was ever built for Harold. No foundation carried his name. No building bore a plaque. But the bench at the park where he Used to sit. It was sanded and varnished by a local woodworker. He didn't know the story. He just felt it should be preserved. The radio in the kitchen of the house he once lived in, it still played jazz every morning. The new tenant never changed. The station and the swing on the porch. A boy from the neighborhood now sat there on weekends, reading quietly, sometimes waving at passing cars. He didn't know whose swing it had been, but he felt safe there. That's the thing about legacies. The ones that last aren't carved in stone or shouted from podiums. They're passed along in small, invisible lines, a folded note, a gentle word, a seat held open for someone unseen. And sometimes the ones who left the greatest mark were never trying to be remembered at all. Final words fade in, one line at a time. Wealth fades. Wisdom echoes, kindness compounds. Let us live lives that echo, one silent presence at a time.